What's going on, YouTube, and welcome to Goal Line Hockey. It's Kevin Forte, and today the Minnesota Wild is our topic of discussion. This is a really interesting team. The Minnesota Wild remind me a lot of the Islanders, maybe for a different reason, but I think the Minnesota Wild have a lot of potential. We saw what this team was capable of during the regular season, but I could see them hopefully having some change this summer. I think overall for the Wild fans, though, this is just tough because I think this is the 50th quote unquote team to make the playoffs and not get to the conference finals, which is kind of an eerie stat across all four of the major sports in Minnesota: the Vikings, the Timberwolves, the Twins, and the Wild. And funny enough, the last team I think was in 91, which was the Minnesota North Stars, that got that far. So it's kind of upsetting looking at this team, how hardcore of a fan base this is, right? The state of hockey once again is out in the first round of the playoffs, and it's kind of the cliche with the Minnesota Wild. So what you have to remember about this, though, I think to take kind of solace in this is look at all the teams that before they went and won the Stanley Cup, how many times they had to get beat in the first or second round. I look in the last decade, the Washington Capitals in 2018, right? They could never get past the first or second round, right? They won the President's Trophy. They added Kevin Shattenkirk the one year, right? And they got bumped in the first round. And then they finally won a cup, and then the narrative goes away. 2019, St. Louis, they could never get past the first or second round, right? They always lost to the Avalanche or the Wild or the Blackhawks. Whoever one of those big dogs in the Central was, the St. Louis Blues could never get over that hump. They win the cup in 2019. You look at the Colorado Avalanche, most recent example here in 2022, right? Last year, they finally won the Stanley Cup. What I'm getting at is a lot of teams have to go through a lot of pain and a lot of playoff experience to finally break through. And I think that's kind of what you're looking at with the Wild. And to think that the Wild are this only team that can't get past the first or second round, it's crazy. In reality, you think about how hard it is to get to the conference finals. Only 4 of the 32 teams get to the conference final alone. So when you look at it in that sense, it's very, very difficult. And when you think about the fact that on any given season, the chances of that happening, right? 50% of the league will make the playoffs. 50% of the teams that make the playoffs will be out in the first round, which leaves you with 25% of the National Hockey League gets to the second round of the playoffs. So for the Minnesota Wild, I know it's tough when you think about it, right? In 2 decades, 3 decades, this is where they've been, but the reality is it just shows you how difficult it really is to get there. You look at the most recent example, the Toronto Maple Leafs. How long have they been struggling to get out of the first round? So it's definitely frustrating. I understand the frustration there, and I wanted to start off with that because I know there's a lot of frustration and just the overall pride of Minnesota sports fans. I do get it. With that said, looking at on the ice, this was a winnable series for the Minnesota Wild. I had them winning the series in 7 games. I thought this was going to be a pretty big dogfight between these two teams, right? 2 very good hockey teams, and Minnesota looked good to start. Now, I will say, Gustafsson looked really good in the beginning of this series. Game 1, he stole the game. Game 2, they go to Fleury. I'm sure that Dean Evason is kind of regretting that. It seems like they lost a lot of momentum in that game 2. A game that they probably could have won and gone up 2-0, and who knows what would have happened after that, right? And my biggest concern, and a lot of Dallas Stars fans were very on me about this, Dallas is winning easy and 4 or 5 and this and that. It's not going to happen that way. But I did mention, if Dallas is going to win this series, the importance of Jake Ottinger. And over his career in the playoffs, he has a .945 save percentage in his career in the postseason between this year and last. And that was my big concern for the Minnesota Wild, was if Jake Ottinger gets really, really hot and is somehow better than Philip Gustafsson, this is going to be a really tough series for Minnesota. And we kind of saw that play out. And we saw that Minnesota, the second they started to lose their identity of that chippy game, and not to think that Foligno is like, I mean, he really is. Marcus Foligno was the lightning rod for kind of getting Dallas chasing everybody around, like Matt Dumba and Foligno, and kind of causing problems. And the second Dallas was able to get on their game and play their style, right? And the addition of Ottinger just being out of this world spectacular, it made it almost impossible for Minnesota to really gain anything back. Now, with that also said, Dean Evanson's lack of changing the lineup really hurt. The team's penalty kill with Marcus Johansson and Freddie Gaudreau, it didn't work. It sounds good on paper, but as this series went along, they really struggled. And the lack of adjustment by Dean Evanson is something worthy of firing, in my opinion. I think that's something that this team really lacked, and this is kind of where I go back to the Islanders thing, is the lack of, it kind of was the chess match, right? The second Dallas could play their game and there wasn't a ton of physical grit and aggression, that favored Dallas the way it favored Carolina in the Islanders-Carolina series. And I think that just fell right into Dallas's hands, allowed them to play their game, and I think Minnesota lost that edge. That's what this team is built on, right? You look at a lot of the guys on the Minnesota Wild, right? Oscar Sundqvist, even Marcus Johansson to an extent, Matt Dumba. Those guys really kind of are the driving force for that. Ryan Hartman, who led the team in points. He had 2 goals and 3 assists. Ryan Hartman is leading this team in points. That's a positive, but again, when you look at this team, you're expecting Zuccarello, who also did have 5 points, but they kept Kaprizov off the board. He scored 1 goal in game 1, and that was it. He did not register a point for the rest of the series, and that really, really hurt the Minnesota Wild. Seeing 1 goal in 6 games for Carrillo and basically a 5-point shutout. He didn't get a point in the last 5 games of this series. It's kind of telling of just how things went for the Wild. Now, this leads me to my next point, which is the captaincy. And I think a lot of people will discuss the conversation of should Jared Spurgeon be the captain and should they trade him? I'm on the bandwagon of both. More so the captaincy. I think he's a good player on this team, but I think something that needs to be mentioned is, and I'm not in the locker room, and I can't say for a fact that this is or isn't happening, but I think it's apparent that there's a lack of urgency, and I don't think Jared Spurgeon is the captain that's going to make this team want to run through a brick wall for him. You need a captain that's not afraid to, freak out, not say freak out, but wake everybody up. And I think the fact that they lost the last 3 games of this series up 2-1, it's kind of telling that Jared Spurgeon doesn't have that in his DNA. We know how Spurgeon is. He's a very cool, collective guy. That's a very nice dude. But come playoff time, and when you need that sense of running through a brick wall, that's not necessarily what you're looking for. And I think there was enough passengers on this team and not enough guys that were driving the play, where that's where you need a guy like your captain, Jared Spurgeon, to kind of get you into it. And credit to the Rangers, in game 5 in New Jersey, Barclay Goodrow, of all people, was getting up, fighting a guy way bigger than him, and that's kind of where you kind of want to see Minnesota do something like that. You want to see a guy kind of try and just wake the boys up on the bench, get into a little scuffle, get into a fight, kind of show something. Minnesota didn't do that. It just kind of looked like they laid over once they lost, the last 2 games, games 4 and 5 were really disappointing for the Minnesota Wild. And I think that's something, or games 5 and 6 were really disappointing for Minnesota. And I think that the second that they started losing those games consecutively between the goalie rotation, the lack of movement on the roster in terms of making lineup changes by Evansson, just everything all around was really disappointing by the Minnesota Wild. And this is a team that has talent, but there's just not enough there. And now you're going to start to see after this, now going into next season, the buyouts of Parise and Suter really making an impact on this team. And I think that's where now you're going to really rely on the younger guys like Kaprizov, Boldy, Eriksson Ek, Ryan Hartman, you're really going to need to rely on those guys to really step up. Guys that are on their entry level deals, guys like Brock Faber, guys like, hopefully we're going to see a little bit more of next season, Marco Rossi. You need to see more from those guys, and I think unfortunately for the Wild, they're kind of in a spot now where they're going to lose some guys that have bigger contracts because they can't fit them under the cap right now. You know, Gustav Nyquist, Oscar Sundqvist, Ryan Reeves, Marcus Johansson, all the veterans of this team will probably no longer be there. And those are kind of the DNA guys that I'm kind of disappointed we didn't see make much of an impact on the lineup here, really on the back half of this series. It kind of just looked like they kind of flopped over and gave up. You know, they're probably going to lose Klingberg, Dumba. I would say all those guys are gone. Dakota Mermis. What's going to happen with Kalen Addison and Sam Steele? Those are two RFAs. Does Minnesota have the cap space? Do they make the cap space to keep those guys? Do they move on from them? There's a lot of questions going into this season, this coming season for Minnesota. It's going to be a very different roster, but I think another really killer for this team is their lack of center depth. And you saw in the Dallas Stars, their center depth, how big of a difference it made for the Dallas Stars. You know, even losing Joe Pavelski, you know, kind of Tyler Seguin just fit in there like a glove. Tyler Seguin, Radek Faksa, Rupe Hintz. You know, they have so many guys that even though they were playing wing, they could jump in and be a center. And that's something that was really lacking for the Minnesota Wild. It's something we've talked about for years for the Minnesota Wild, and it's really hurting them in the playoffs. And now you talk about Joel Eriksson being out with an injury, it just added more salt to the wound for a team that was already, even with Eriksson probably still at a disadvantage down the middle against a matchup like the Dallas Stars. And that's kind of where I think this is really going to upset Minnesota Wild fans, is if somehow Seattle gets past, again, this might not matter by the time this video is done, but even with Colorado, I think whoever wins, you know, now Dallas, not to say they have an easy ticket to the conference final because Colorado did win the cup last year, but the Dallas Stars could very well find themselves a pretty easy path to the conference finals by beating Minnesota in 6. Colorado looks beat up in the bottom 6 in their depth and in between the pipes. Dallas could very well find themselves going pretty easy there. Minnesota, this is a missed opportunity for the Wild. And now, like I said, with all this stuff happening behind the scenes with the contracts and things like that, I could see them getting a new coach. I think it makes a lot of sense. A lot of people have liked Andrew Brunette. I think that could be a really interesting fit. I believe he's in New Jersey as an assistant. I could definitely see that being a fit. I think the Minnesota Wild are definitely going to explore that if that does come about. Mark Savard could be another interesting one if the Minnesota Wild decide to let go of Dean Evason. But, you know, I never wish ill will on coaches and firing coaches, but based off of what we've seen, Dean Evason just doesn't seem like the guy. And he has not won a playoff series since he was in the WHL back in 2005. That's the last time he has won any sort of, as a coach, won any sort of playoff series. Was 2005, almost 2 decades ago. So it's kind of telling right there that this is just maybe not the right fit for the Minnesota Wild with where they're at right now. He's a good coach during the regular season. He gets a lot out of these guys. But when it comes crunch time, it just seems like he doesn't do well under the pressure. And the Minnesota Wild have paid dearly for it. You know, some positives for this team going into the summer. Like I said, I've really liked Ryan Hartman. I think he's a really good player that's going to help out in this top 6 next season. Joel Eriksson back and healthy next season. I'm really excited to see what he can do for this team. You know, Matt Boldy looked really good down the stretch. Obviously disappointed in the playoffs, but again, that's a little more maturity and growing a little bit more poise. I think it's good experience for him. Connor Dewar, saw some positive things out of him. I expect to see him back. Same thing for Marco Rossi on the blue line. I really liked what we saw from Brock Faber. I think he was probably one of the better players in the series for the Minnesota Wild. So I'm really excited to see the future of a guy like Brock Faber there in Minnesota. And then in between the pipes, I think it's kind of at this point a guarantee that we see Jesper Wallstedt and Philip Gustafsson as your goalie tandem moving forward. I think Fleury's going to get moved somewhere. I really think he's going to end up in Pittsburgh. But I think a tandem of Wallstead and Philip Gustafson is a really good tandem, something that the Minnesota Wild fans should be excited for going into next season. There's a lot of young talent on this team, even in the prospect system, that I think is really exciting when you look at, Liam Ogren, who they just signed, Michael Milne, looks like a pretty decent prospect. Damian Giroux, another depth player. On the back end, there's a couple of guys that I kind of like. I like Ryan O'Rourke and Carson Lambos, some pretty good young players. So the Minnesota Wild, it's not the end of the world for this team. There is reasons to believe in the Minnesota Wild. Maybe not next season, because I think this window has closed for this current group. But I think maybe the next 2 years, it's a little bit of a slow process for them. But once some of these guys gain more experience, they kind of get themselves out of the buyout hell that they put themselves in for the next really 2 years. After that, this is going to be a very good Minnesota team. And I think there's a lot of really good pieces to build around. There is questions about what's going to happen with Kaprizov in a couple years in 2026, but you worry about that then. I think right now, even, God forbid, they lose Kaprizov in 2026, they still have so many good players other than Kaprizov. And I'd like to think he'll stay in Minnesota. We'll see where the state of the team is. But there is a lot of positives here that I think it's frustrating right now. It seems like it's been forever. But this current iteration of the Minnesota Wild team, there's a lot to like. I think if they can add a little bit more of guys that, back in the day that they used to have, like Cal Clutterbuck, Jason Zucker, those were guys that were maybe not the best players on those Wild teams. Charlie Coyle, another example. I think those were guys that were playoff performers that got the team energized, that got the team going, and I think there's a lack of that on this current version of the Minnesota Wild. And if they could add guys like that, I think this is a team that's going to be a force to be reckoned with in the next 3 or 4 years. And it's not something that I think Wild fans want to hear because they want to win now. But the reality is, with the way their division is, with the way that this team is currently built, I mean, listen, 2 years ago we were talking about full tank rebuild, right? They just bought out Suter, Parise, brought in a new GM, brought in a new head coach, and the turnaround of this team has been pretty good, all things considered. Bill Guerin has done a very good job with this team. I know it sucks, but the future looks bright for the Wild. So let me know what you guys think down below. What do you think of the Minnesota Wild? Should they keep Dean Evason? What trade should they make? Should they try to bring in another center? Should Jared Spurgeon be the captain of this team next fall? Let me know your guys' thoughts down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.